Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.
Welcome to the 75th Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. And Jacob, there has been something of a pause between the 74th Moggcast and the 75th because we have had Easter and parliamentary recesses. But welcome.
Oh, thank you very much. Yes, I have missed our regular engagement, but we always follow the parliamentary calendar.
Well, in the last Moggcast but one, which I find out was as long ago as February the 22nd, I asked you about the power of a body called the Senior Leadership Committee of the Civil Service to authorise the appointment of a candidate to one of the top 200 civil service jobs without having to undertake a recruitment competition. Now, if my memory is right, you said this area of the civil service was not really your responsibility. It was the responsibility of Heather Wheeler, that this was all news to you, and it was very interesting. So, last week it was announced that all senior civil service jobs would be advertised externally and that ministers will have a veto over internal recruitment competitions. So, was this Rees-Mogg in action?
Well, it was a decision made within the Cabinet Office, and obviously that is led by the Prime Minister, but with the Chancellor Duchy, Steve Barclay, being the most influential figure outside Downing Street directly, though he's there as well. So I think he deserves more of the credit than I do. But I think opening up the civil service is a good thing to do, and that particularly the senior civil service, because you want to recruit from a wider pool, and you want to ensure that people who are getting the top jobs within the civil service are the most suitable candidates.
So you are, of course, a minister at the Cabinet Office, and you're very generously and doubtless rightly giving the credit to the Prime Minister and Steve Barclay. But did you raise the issue?
The issue came up and was mentioned to me, but this was something that Steve Barclay had been working on before I was appointed. So I think he genuinely deserves more of the credit rather than it being all down to me.
So alas, you can't claim the credit, and neither, therefore, sadly, can the Moggcast.
Well, Paul, you can claim lots of credit for many things, but I think getting it some publicity certainly helped. It helps, as always, focus people's minds.
Do you happen to know, was there any internal pushback about this decision? Because it was a very closely guarded secret, as far as I know, until Benjamin Barnard of Policy Exchange wrote about it.
Well, it's quite a complex issue, and as you know, the civil service is independent from ministers, and the appointment of civil servants is something that ministers don't get involved with as to the specifics of who is appointed. There was a new civil service commissioner being appointed in the form of Gisela Stewart, Baroness Stewart, and so there were a number of people who had to agree and support this, because I think both you and I accept that an independent civil service is a constitutional benefit in this country.
I want to come back to questions arising out of the decision we're discussing, but just to pick up something that you said about the independence of the civil service. I'm really asking this question, as I always seek to do, for the benefit of the listeners. But what is the constitutional position, I suppose, if you, Jacob Rees-Mogg, want civil servants back in the office as you do, and a permanent secretary at a department says, well, Minister, that's all very well, but I don't agree for reasons A, B, and C, and we're not going to do it, or we're going to do it in a slower way than you want?
As I understand it, and I've obviously looked at this, the legal position is that within each department, the Secretary of State or a minister to whom this has been delegated by the Secretary of State has the authority to demand that civil servants work according to their contracts, and that the job of the permanent secretary would be to implement that. And it would be improper for a permanent secretary to obstruct a direct decision of a minister in this regard. And I think this is an opportunity to say that those who are working for the civil service do actually work very hard. It is easy to parody what I've been saying as criticisms of the civil servants, but Many of them work much longer hours than they are contractually obliged to do. We're doing this interview at 7:20. The special advisor, they're expected to work all hours God sends, but there's a civil servant in the room who is well beyond his contractual hours. I just finished my last meeting with a group of civil servants, all of whom were well beyond their contractual hours. So there is a hard-working ethos in the civil service, unfortunately not represented by their trade union, which seems to want them to be in Tuscany to call in to work.
What evidence do you have that working from home doesn't deliver the goods in the way that working in an office does?
Well, you just need to look at DVLA. DVLA also went on strike, which made it even more difficult. But simply the post didn't get opened. So people who'd written in to get their driving licence renewed didn't have it attended to because there weren't people going in to open it. There are some jobs that need to be done. There's I think it was Berkeley University that recently published a report saying that creativity was reduced by people working from home. You didn't get that clash of ideas. We saw it in the Moggcast. The Moggcast was not as effective when you were on one end of the telephone and I was on the other.
I suppose it might be argued that the DVLA is a good example of stuff that has to be done in an office. As a permanent secretary might say, well, there are other people working on other tasks that don't have to be in an office, and one study from Berkeley University is not conclusive.
I accept that there will be some roles where it makes remarkably little difference. But I think overall the efficacy of an organisation does need people to be in the office. And it is no surprise to me that Goldman Sachs was one of the first big institutions to say people needed to get back to work. But it is one of the most effective, hard-nosed corporations in the world. And it keeps that reputation by delivering an exceptional financial service to people. And it recognised that people needed to be in to do their job properly.
Okay, let me go back to interviewing outside applicants for senior civil service posts. Were I being cynical, I suppose it's a cynical question, you'd have to ask, how do you prevent the senior civil servants who are doing the interview just to quietly reverting to their usual practice by simply fixing matters in favour of one of their own?
Because you've got the Civil Service Commission, which is independent, and it can supervise the interviews. So there is an independent check on this. It won't necessarily be in every interview, but it will be sampling the interviews to ensure that they are carried out properly.
Apparently there's one member of full-time commission staff for every 23,000 civil servants. So it might be quite an oversight job for the commission. Will the government be beefing it up?
Well, the Civil Service Commission is independent and is able to ask for more resources if it needs it. But they don't interview every civil service job that is going. This is focusing on the senior civil service, which is a much more manageable number, and doing a sample of those with the commissioners that they've got is not, I think, an impossible burden.
No, I understand that. I'm simply asking if they've got the capacity, if they're also delegated to do lots of other things, which they will be.
Well, they have some particular delegations, but the interviewing panels that they sit on, as I understand it, are only for the senior civil service. They don't sit on every civil service appointment. There wouldn't possibly be enough of them to do that.
And it's all very well to hire external applicants, but they have to be supported once they arrive. In 2016, the government asked Catherine Baxdendale, a former Tesco executive, to complete an independent report on how to best attract and retain talent recruited into the senior civil service. Policy Exchange has recommended repeating the exercise. Might now be a good time to do that?
It's a very interesting question. It may simply be better to look at the Baxdendale Report and see whether the recommendations of that have been implemented effectively. I was unaware of her report until you mentioned it, but now it's an opportunity to dig it out and see what can be done. I think sometimes having a report becomes an excuse for inaction rather than actually doing something, particularly if a report's already been done, which hasn't been acted upon.
Well, if it's reported in due course that the Catherine Baxdendale report has been acted upon, no doubt I can come back and ask you about it, and no doubt you will lay the credit at the door of the Prime Minister, at the door of Steve Barclay, and we can have that conversation all over again. So let me now just broaden the canvas for a moment and talk about this plan to reduce the civil service by 91,000, I think, or thereabouts. It struck me that this might be an important moment for the government in that to date, what has been taking place, broadly speaking, is big public expenditure increases have been funded by fairly sizable tax increases. But it seemed to me that I could hear the voice of someone here, the Chancellor, the Prime Minister, maybe other ministers saying, we've gone as far down that road as we can. Now, if we need to increase spending or cut taxes, we're going to have to do it by finding efficiencies. This feels like going back to Thatcherism, doesn't it?
Well, I've never gone away from Thatcherism, as you know, in the many conversations that we've had. But one of the things Margaret Thatcher was very good at was ensuring that her economic policy met the circumstances of the day. And I think this is simply a recognition of the circumstances of the day. 2 years ago, what else did you do? You had to spend money. John Redwood and I were both entirely in agreement with what was being done, of spending hundreds of billions of pounds because you needed to maintain the structures of the economy. The issue now is an inflationary one. And what do you do with an inflationary problem? You have to apply monetary and fiscal discipline. You can't spend in the way that you spent to deal with a collapse, potentially, in all forms of supply. Now, you're dealing with demand that exceeds supply, and the government mustn't add fuel to that fire. And therefore, the first place to start is with the size of government itself, because you want the government's interventions to be helping individuals who are most particularly affected by the inflation, rather than making the inflation worse by having greater than necessary public sector.
Is another comparison that might work the moment when the coalition came in, another government that was determined to retrench the rate of increase in public spending. And Liam Byrne, the former Labour Chief Secretary of the Treasury, famously left this note that David Laws, the new Chief Secretary of the Treasury, picked up that said, in terms, apologies, but there's no more money left. Is that basically the situation now?
Well, it's rather different, actually, because then there was no more money left that the government was spending in ordinary time with £1 in every 4 borrowed. Now what has happened isn't that there's no more money left, it's that inflation has raised its ugly head. And one of the means of dealing with inflation is to keep fiscal policy under control. So it's not that there isn't the ability to borrow is there. It isn't even that the deficit has been falling faster than forecast. It is that you don't want to add fuel to the fire, and government expenditure is that fuel.
Is the ability to borrow really there when interest rates are heading up?
It depends on the structure of your borrowing, but there hasn't been any shortage of bidders in the gilt auctions.
And there's a constraint present that was not present, say, a year and a half ago when interest rates were on the floor, surely.
And the Bank of England was buying a lot of the debt that was being issued. And you obviously don't want that to be happening in an inflationary period, because quantitative easing is of its nature inflationary.
Are you satisfied with the way the bank is going about its business? And there were reports over the weekend that the government is basically worried that the bank has too inflationary a mindset. I found myself writing the other day about the bank and quoting a House of Lords report, a report by the Economic Committee that I think contained a former governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, that was worried that the bank had now got vested interest in inflation because it reduces the value of the debt.
Well, I mean, I thought that House of Lords report was an extremely interesting one. I think it was written by Lord Forsyth, Michael Forsyth, who is a very impressive and knowledgeable figure. I think it's been very difficult for the bank, that it needed to take the action that it took 2 years ago. And the move is quite extraordinarily rapid in terms of inflation. You have gone from the bank being unable to meet its 2% inflation target because inflation was too low, to being unable to meet its target because inflation is too high. But not only too high, but way above the target, and with interest rates that are starting from such an historic low level that what it might have done in normal times is simply not open to it. I mean, the bank cannot move to positive real interest rates without bankrupting us all. So the bank is constrained. I think, I've always thought Andrew Bailey is a very serious-minded figure, a capable regulator. I had some criticisms of his predecessor, which probably are recorded in the annals of the Moggcast, but that was then and this is now.
Do you think, however, that the last burst, as it were, of QE was unwise?
Well, the last burst of QE was whilst we were still getting through the effects of COVID, which was a different economic circumstance. And they were focusing on keeping the economy afloat rather than inflation. I'm slightly avoiding your question, as you clearly realise. I don't think it is for a cabinet minister to criticise an independent Bank of England. I think it's similar to criticising the judiciary. The Bank of England is independent for a purpose, and Andrew Bailey's given evidence today to the Treasury Select Committee, yesterday for our listeners, and I think that's worth paying attention to, and I think his understanding of how difficult things are is perfectly realistic.
So you would think these reports claiming that ministers are critical of the bank over the weekend were unhelpful?
Well, I don't think that formal criticisms of the bank by ministers are what I would wish to do. There'll always be a discussion about what people think privately. That's a different matter.
I'd leave it to the listeners to venture speculation about what informal criticism of the bank might look like. Pass on to the next question, which may be our final one. And it's a very long time. If a week is a long time in politics anyway, it's a very long time since the last Moggcast. So I can actually ask two sort of final questions about matters that were preoccupying us then. One is Ukraine, and the other is Partygate. Let's sort of start with Ukraine. If one is trying to follow this war with no military knowledge and no knowledge of Ukraine, it is difficult to do. But what do you think the period since this stage of Russia's invasion of Ukraine began in late February and now, what has it told us about the nature and efficiency and operability of the Russian regime, do you think?
You quite rightly caveat your question by saying it's a discussion between two people who are not military experts, and I'm definitely not. But in my naivety, I thought that the Russian machine was a formidable and effective machine that had enormous punch behind it. And it has turned out to be unable to achieve its most basic objectives. And the courage of the Ukrainians in taking it on and stopping it in its tracks is really very remarkable. But Russia is not as strong as Mr. Putin probably thought.
Just one follow-up question from that. A parliamentary colleague of yours who, I won't name because he didn't say it publicly, who's highly intelligent and well-versed in the ways of the press, said to me rather airily, oh, well, it's proof all this that we don't need to increase our defence expenditure beyond present levels because Russia's threat has turned out to be a paper tiger and therefore we've nothing much to worry about. What do you think about that?
Well, I'd better not make spending commitments on behalf of the Treasury and on behalf of the Ministry of Defence, but we have to remain a major global defence power. That I think, I'm bound to say this, but the leadership of the Prime Minister in getting the West together to give a clear answer to Putin was fundamental. and this was bringing the sanctions together. It was selling armaments to Ukraine, delivering armaments to Ukraine, training to Ukraine's armed forces. And we couldn't have done that. We wouldn't have had credibility doing all of that if we hadn't been a major global defense power. And that means spending the amount of money that is needed to ensure that we remain there. And I'm afraid assuming that your opponent will be a paper tiger is a risk. Sometimes the paper turns out to be more fleshy than you anticipated.
Just and finally, I said correctly, we haven't had a Moggcast since, I think, before Easter. I mean, you might, if you were an unpleasant pedant, which you're not, have picked me up and said, well, of course, I did have my live Moggcast at the half-yearly council with Mark Wallace, where there were various remarks exchanged about eggs and chickens. But let me just ask you about something that you said.
But that was before Easter anyway.
It was before, was it?
Yeah,
I'm not
yeah.
sure we've done a Moggcast since then. Right.
No,
I mean, back in the annals of time, the records will show. But you referred to Partygate, as it's sometimes known, at that point, when people were, if anything, more conscious of the war then than now. I think it was more in the forefront of reporting. And you described Partygate as disproportionate fluff. You said it's shown up for the disproportionate fluff of politics that it was, rather than something of fundamental seriousness about the safety of the world and about the established global order. Well, obviously, parties in Downing Street or in Durham are not, matters of concern about the established world order. But do you think it was right to describe it as disproportionate fluff? I mean, it's these parties are serious matter to many people who couldn't see their friends and relatives during the lockdown.
I think there are two different things. I think one is the pain and suffering of those during the lockdown who weren't able to spend final minutes, final hours with people who were dying, inability to comfort the dying, and those who weren't able to go to funerals. And that was a real and genuine pain. And we must, in the inquiry, look at whether those were proportionate and sensible restrictions, or whether they were, in fact, excessive and inhuman.
I mean, sorry to interrupt, but it's not disproportionate fluff to them, is it?
As I said, we're looking at two different things. Whether the rules were proportionate is something that we want to look at in case this ever happens again. They were introduced for all sorts of good reasons. People didn't know how serious or not serious COVID was. And the pain those people suffered is very genuine. But comforting the dying is a fundamental Christian duty. And that the state denied that is something about which I think one should be very concerned. And I would hope that it is something we never do again, and I hope that the inquiry will therefore look at that and come to that conclusion. It may come to another conclusion, but it should certainly look at it. Then there's what went on in Downing Street, and is that fundamental to how we are governed, or what went on in Durham? Because I apply the same standard to both of them. And I don't think it is. I actually think that both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition have made exactly the same defence. It didn't occur to either of them that they were in breach of the rules at the time. And they were with people they were seeing anyway. There was no epidemiological risk from what was going on. And so I think the focus on it has been disproportionate.
Just to be clear, I mean, the scale of the reporting, the nature of the reporting, it is all that has been disproportionate fluff, in your view.
Well, if you take the incident for which the Prime Minister has been fined, that was reported in the Times contemporaneously, and nobody batted an eyelid. So something that was not thought of as being out of the ordinary in any way at the time has dominated our newspapers, dominated particularly the BBC, actually, who loves all of this, for weeks. I think that is disproportionate.
Do you feel the BBC has been particularly irresponsible?
Well, it's been a little bit more awkward for Sky to discuss it for obvious reasons.
We could go there, and we could go in many other places, but I've reached, finished as many inquiries as this episode of the Moggcast will allow, although there is a formidable logjam of questions, which will have to wait until the next one, whenever it is, which I hope is soon. And Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much.
Paul, thank you for coming in.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.